Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to the Lessons of Vietnam show, where we strive to tell the real stories of the Vietnam War and the men and women who served it. It's important to us to dispel the myths, mistruths, and misunderstandings of the war and its participants. I am Bill Dixon, Vietnam veteran, 67-68, Tet survivor. I'm your host of the show. We broadcast from Raleigh, North Carolina studios of Nissan Communications, who thanks to his generosity, donates his time and equipment so we can tell the real story of the Vietnam War. You are welcome and encouraged to participate with me anytime we have a guest. Also, if you have questions, comments, and so forth, you're encouraged to call in during the show. As you can see there on the screen, it's the telephone number is 919-518-9773. Or even better, if you go on to Skype, and that is Computers 2K Voice, and be part of the show, make comments, keep me straight, make sure I'm saying the right thing, because I do a lot of research, and there's so much garbage out there that, but I try to pick out the real stuff and so forth. And sometimes that's very hard to get all the myths and so forth. It definitely takes having a little bit of studying the history of the Vietnam War and the people and so forth, talking to different veterans and so forth. Tonight is our part 2 of the comparisons and myth killers. Tonight I hope to finish it up, and hope to have you some good information there. I think you'll see some things that you didn't know before. That's my job, to bring out something, even though hardened Vietnam vets, to actually see things and learn things they didn't know about the war. It's like a mule who wears this harness on his head and has these blinders. We only knew what was going on where we were standing at that particular moment. I never knew where I was because I didn't understand Vietnamese, and nobody told me where I was. I just saw a sign that said I was there when I could see a sign. In the jungles, they didn't have a whole lot of signs. So we're going to get started now. Like I said, oh, by the way, I just wanted to tell you that I was very honored this past week. Friday, I drove down to Goldsboro, North Carolina, and stood in the flag line for Colonel Edgar Felton Davis. Colonel Davis was shot down in Laos in September of 1968, and his body, or his remains, were identified about 2 years ago, somewhat by accident. They had already been to the crash site a couple times and never could find anything. And while they were there, a Vietnamese came up and said, "Oh, my dad found some remains and buried them next to the house some years ago." And they went over and dug those up, and according to DNA, that was Colonel Davis. And it was really great to see the people turn out. They had about 175 bikes escort the casket from Raleigh-Durham Airport, where he came in, down to Goldsboro, which is about an hour and 10 minutes from here. 175 bikes, and people were on the overpasses with flags along the side of the road. And then on Friday, when the funeral was there, the big turnout, people side the road, people pulling off the side of the road when they saw what it was, getting out and saluting and so forth. It was very moving to see these people get out and pay this man honors and respect. And I was very honored to stand in the flag line with the Patriot Guard guys and girls to honor Colonel Davis. And now we're down to 38 who are still unaccounted for from the Vietnam War. Now let's get started with the show. Our first slide here is talking about the news media and so forth, and how they kind of readjusted the wars to a certain extent. One does not get to be or stay a superstar unless one gives one's audience what it wants and how they want it. Basically, what the concept we're talking about up until then is pretty much people gave the news. And then all of a sudden, the news talking heads, as we call them now, become celebrities themselves. They were almost a bigger celebrity sometimes than the news they're reporting. At the point in time when the draft dodgers and anti-war audience number reached a critical mass, the media decided to pander to them. That was a shift because that's who that was watching and buying their sponsors' products and so forth. So they started going a little bit more way to what the anti-war movement was doing and so forth. Now, even in the magazines, Life magazine, I don't think they even make that anymore, but it was one of the big magazines of that time. Just you had to have a Life magazine to read. It had some great pictures. That was the magazine that Roman Rockwell's pictures was in, I think, all the time. It was quite a popular magazine. Well, on June 27th, 1969, the issue of Life magazine's feature article was a picture of 250 men that were killed during what they said was a typical week in Vietnam. Life magazine stated the purpose of these photos was to show their concern for the sanctity of human life. They weren't trying to sensationalize and sell more magazines. They were doing it for the sanctity of human life. By doing this, the tragedy of the Vietnam War was illustrated and showed them the sons, fathers, and neighbors in America were dying in Vietnam. Okay. However, in 1969, the typical week's death toll from highway accidents in the United States was 1,082. With Life's concern for the sanctity of life, why did they publish the photos of the traffic victims? 30,000 people a year or more are killed in traffic accidents. But no, they knew where its readers were and what their readers wanted to see. Who was the enemy? The American military sometimes remarked, we should not fear the enemy. They would only take your life. Instead, the fear of the media, it will steal your honor. And it's even today, the media is still trying to steal the Vietnam veterans' honor. There's a young man who wrote a book, Nick Turse, which I'm going to talk about a little another day, who basically says that we killed anything that moved. It was a standing order. That slaps all of us Vietnam vets in the face, as far as I'm concerned, and the people who said we were all baby killers. But the news media just will sap your honor. Now, let's give you another example. Newsweek, now they're still out there. During the Battle of Khe Sanh, that was a 77-day battle of the Khe Sanh base. And it was a tough place to be. A 1968 Newsweek story of the siege of Khe Sanh had 29 photos. 18 of these showed Marines huddled under fire, wounded or dead. In other words, they were almost like rats in their little groves, hiding up under the things and so forth. It was very big at the time. In fact, President Johnson, Lyndon Baines Johnson, made a statement. He didn't want another damn Dien Bien Phu. Dien Bien Phu is where the French got their butts kicked by the Viet Minh, and he wanted to make sure that the Americans didn't have a Dien Bien Phu there. But they're showing you there about everybody's climbing in the holes and so forth and the head down. But that wasn't the total story. None of the pictures ever showed the Marines firing back. None of the pictures that you could ever find out there. It's really hard to find them. In spite of the fact that the Marine artillery fired 10 rounds at the communists for every one received. They were having to supply Khe Sanh by planes coming by and kind of touching the ground and kept going, and the parachute would come out and drag the supplies out. But as you can see right there, there was a lot of firing back. That dirt right there is some of the reddest dirt you have ever seen. I mean, it is red. Khe Sanh today is mostly a coffee plantation, but they are trying to make it into a museum. But if you ever get a chance to go to Vietnam, that's a good place to stop and see. They're eventually going to have a pretty nice museum there, but they got some crazy signs up. You can tell they have a picture of the Marines leaving after this battle, and it says the Marines are escaping from Khe Sanh, which is not quite true because we butted heads with the North Vietnamese army there, and they lost a lot of men. So, okay. The news coverage was so biased that even today, Khe Sanh is perceived the defeat of the Americans. A lot of people, and you can see that red dirt. The Marines lost 205 men. The Communist North Vietnamese Army, we're not talking about the Viet Cong now, the guerrillas. This was the North Vietnamese Army, the guys with the same equipment and training and so forth. They lost 15,000 plus at the Battle of Khe Sanh. Now, they never overrun Khe Sanh. They lost, let's see, I don't know what, the 15,000 as opposed to 205. Now, if you were a family of that 205, that's pretty bad. But 15,000, 205, how in the world anybody could say that it was a win for the NVA, even though they do say that now if you go there into the museum. Just have a good sense of humor as you read their signs, because there's nobody there to argue with them. Now, this is a quote by Marshall McLuhan, and evidently he was a bigwig at the time, and I didn't know who he was, so I looked him up, and this is what it says about him. One of the most charismatic, controversial, and original thinkers of our time, whose remarkable reception propelled him onto the international stage. Marshall McLuhan is universally regarded as the father of communications and media studies and prophet of the information age. Now, what did he say? Television brought the brutality of war into the comfort of the living room. Vietnam was lost in the living rooms of America, not on the battlefields of Vietnam. Okay? And he's supposed to be one of the smartest men of the day. In October 1983, Newsweek said, at a certain point, television became more important than the war itself. That's a terrible thing to say about a war over television. At that one point was the 1968 Tet Offensive. Vietnam was America's first televised war, and the nation did not handle it well. It was hard to sit down at dinner and listen to the body counts, and they show you the pictures of like the Khe Sanh, where the Marines were wounded and hiding up into the holes and so forth, and never showed them fighting back. It just, I understand being back here, how hard it was to watch it. So early on, the TV media recognized the amazing potential for television to exploit the war of sensationalism. TV was really coming on to its own at that time. I remember as a little boy watching TV, if you could actually see through the smoke or the clouds and the snow on the screen, you could see a figure moving. Boy, you were really good. You had your good antenna. Here in North Carolina, we had channel 7, I believe, out of Washington, North Carolina, and channel 5 here, and channel 9 out of Greenville, I believe it was. And that was the 3 channels we could get. Due to lack of formal declaration of war, they were not restricted and became mesmerized by the power they possessed. The media quickly spun out of control. And it hasn't changed it today. They're still in control. You ever been lined up to watch a college ball game, and all of a sudden it's changed because it's now a TV time and they want to balance it out? So maybe starting 2 or 3 hours later or 2 or 3 hours earlier, even though you were supposed to be there earlier. And so forth. You got to change your plans to fit what the TV wanted. Well, that was the same way it was back then, except they didn't change it. They just the media's influence exerted power far beyond any description, and eventually altered the American view and gave the communists the war outcome in its favor. As you can see right there, Saigon surrenders to Viet Cong. Withdrawal ends role in U.S. Now, I'm going to go into this more, but if you see that picture right there, if you can see it, there's a helicopter there, and there's a whole bunch of people trying to get on that helicopter. And I heard so many times how that was a helicopter sitting on the American embassy, and all the Americans were escaping. First of all, that is not the American embassy. That is the CIA building behind the American embassy. That building is still there today. That building has been remodeled, but it's still there. The American embassy building has been torn down. And one of the things you see there are the Vietnamese who worked for the Americans who were trying to get. Most of the Americans had already gone, and all of them would have been gone had not the ambassador of United States ambassador to Vietnam done what he was supposed to do and got them out earlier, but he just kept right on waiting. In fact, the president had to make 2 or 3 different phone calls just to tell him to get on the airplane, on the helicopter, and leave. One of our past guests, Norman Gaddis was actually at the Pentagon then. He was a POW at the time when he was still in the Air Force. He was at the Pentagon, and he was tasked with the job of calling the ambassador in Saigon and saying, the president said, get your tail on the helicopter now. So that's one of the reasons you see that. Now, there's our old friend again, Walter Cronkite, as I like to call him, Walter Concrete. Most Americans see the 1968 Tet Offensive as the turning point in the war. The American people lost faith with the government and the war. In fact, President Johnson was reported to say, when we lost Walter Cronkite, we lost the war, because Walter Cronkite was the most trusted and loved reporter of all times at the time. And when he turned against the war during the Tet Offensive, America turned against the war. It was like somebody flipped a switch. It all changed. Now, one of the things that created the thought patterns or the perception of how the war was going was, this is the fence for the American embassy. This fence goes all the way around the embassy. It was reported by Peter Arnett that the Viet Cong had blew a hole in the fence, had gone in and gotten into the embassy and were ransacking the embassy. That's not what happened, folks. Been there. I was in Vietnam. I went by the embassy a couple days later. As you see that arrow right there, that was the hole in the embassy fence. This was this was completely false. Arnett was later fired for posting another false report later on. He had a habit of you ever heard of fake news? Y'all thought it was just new stuff, didn't you? No, it started back during the Vietnam War. Huh? No, it wasn't. No, that might have been, well, it was before CNN. Right. February 1st, 1960, around dawn, communist sappers, that's men with dynamite, explosive guys, blew a small hole in the embassy outer fence wall. Some of them entered the grounds and engaged in a brief battle with embassy guards. There was a couple of MPs that were killed, American MPs, but there was one captured, I believe. The rest of them were, one Viet Cong was captured, and the rest of them were killed. As you can see there, they never got into the embassy at all. Some of them entered the grounds and engaged in a brief battle with the embassy guards, as it says, okay? Now, this is the embassy and embassy compound. That embassy is now gone. But if you see you see the helicopter on top. Well, right behind it, you'll see that building. That building back there was the CIA office building there. But you see that fence all the way around the compound and so forth. And they blew one little small hole and got through. They never entered the embassy building. Later, an investigation revealed the attack was a suicide mission to only get into the grounds and to cause a psychological gesture for the benefit of American television. And they did what they were supposed to do. They did that little gesture, and it definitely hurt the American psyche. But that's the compound. Now, that's one of the Viet Congs they captured. American television watchers were astounded when told that communists had the American embassy in Vietnam. I mean, that's like taking over Vietnam itself when you took the embassy, because inside that ground, in that fence, was basically America. Even though the story was corrected later, it mattered not to the American people. They had already decided that they took over America. General David Palmer is quoted as saying, 30,000 communists dead in the first 10 days of the Tet Offensive, and nothing would achieve as much as the 20 communists who blew a hole in the embassy wall and survived for 4 hours. That 20 communists just blowing a hole in the fence did more than anything else. As you can see, they lost 30,000 communists within 10 days. Another observer noted, the American might not understand the power of television propaganda, but the enemy sure as hell did. That's why you see these pictures. Now, the picture there of the general shooting the guy, he probably shouldn't have done it, but at the same time, if you knew the whole story of what happened there, you would have probably have pulled the trigger too. I have told the story before. I'm not going to worry about it now, but there's the people getting on the helicopter again. And that little girl running down the street who was hit by napalm. Now, that was what we call a friendly fire accident. Now, it ain't nothing friendly about a bomb falling on you, but the South Vietnamese Air Force dropped a napalm bomb on her village. Americans had nothing to do with it. It wasn't an American airplane. It was an American bomb. It wasn't ordered by the Americans. The Americans didn't order the Vietnamese to do anything. This was a mistake by a South Vietnamese pilot who thought he saw the enemy and dropped his bomb in the wrong place, which happens a lot in the course of war. But when asked why, they never reported anything about North Vietnam or the fact that Russia and China and Cuba were supporting them. Cuba, China, and Russia all had men in Vietnam and supplies. They had advisors like we started out with who were actually there. I heard someplace or saw where the Chinese had admitted they lost about 10,000 of their own people during the Vietnam War there. And the reporter said was essentially that the communist North Vietnam would not let the reporters into North Vietnam. So that's why they didn't report against them, because they couldn't get into Vietnam. With no access to North Vietnam, there are left huge gaps in accurately reporting what was happening north of the DMZ. In other words, it wasn't worth their trouble to find out and do research and find out what was really going on in the North because they couldn't get their junkets together and stay in the nice hotels and so forth. So they decided no reporting was better than anything else. So they didn't report anything at all. Now, 1959 to 1973, during the entire period of American involvement in Vietnam, only 2,594,000 U.S. military actually served inside of Vietnam. Now, I think that number is just a little bit low. The numbers I've read was like 2,700,000 plus a couple 100,000. Compare this with the 50 million plus draft dodgers and their supporters. You have to answer why the American perspective of the Vietnam War is so skewed. 2,700,000 actual veterans, and there were 50,000 draft dodgers and war protesters. 50 million, excuse me. Yeah. It kind of gives you an idea why we were called baby killers and everything else, because the reporting was definitely skewed, because the American public, all they saw was the protesters. The bulk of the American draft dodgers, multitudes shared one common emotion: guilt. This guilt was well summarized in an April 1980 Washington Post article by Arthur Hadley, who said, "Those who avoided Vietnam service through loopholes in the draft, being in most part honorable men, now feel guilty." I have a problem with his use of honorable men. There were some of the people who honestly felt the war was wrong and so forth, but the vast majority was, it's okay you send my neighbor, but don't send me. And his is a comment from someone who a draft dodger who didn't get there. All these eyes on me, the town, the whole universe, and I couldn't risk the embarrassment. O'Brien, 59. He and many others who were drafted feared anyone they knew to look down on them for fleeing from being a man and fighting the war. In other words, they were afraid if they went to Canada and so forth, people looked down on them and give them a hard time because they were cowards or whatever. So a lot of guilt out there, and today it's still out there. I read a report today that the war protesters were more important than those of us who fight in the war, because they were more patriotic because they were protesting the war. Now, looking out there, as I mentioned a while ago, 2,700,000, we'll say. There's a lot of what we call wannabes out there. Here's a guy. I don't always steal valor, but when I do, I steal all of it. Now look at all those badges and tags and patches. I don't even know where all of them are for. But if you start looking at them, you may be a guy with an Army uniform on that's wearing Navy, Marines, Air Force, Army patches. They just want patches. Fake soldier uses uniforms to get Black Friday deals. And people say, well, why do people do that? Because now it seems like they like us because we were Vietnam vets. Back then, they didn't like us too much. So they're always trying to get what they can get for free. The last U.S. Census listed 13 million Vietnam veterans. And it was on the census, so it had to be true. Kind of like if it's on the internet, it's true. These men relieve these feelings either by malicious attacks on everything military or become 200% American and make Attila the Hun sound like a mother goose. You can hear some of these guys tell stories. I went into a class a few years ago, and the first question the students asked me was, how many Vietnamese communists did you kill and eat and skin? I'm going, do what? He said, yeah, there was a guy in the class yesterday speaking, a Vietnam vet speaking yesterday, and he talked about killing the communists and skinning them and eating the meat. And these guys, these wannabes out there, they make Rambo look like Mother Goose. Less than 3 million men and women served in country, but it's 13 million claimed. So don't always take the fact that a person says they're a Vietnam vets that they were true Vietnam vets. Some of them have so many. I don't know how they can walk with their jackets on. They have so many medals and so forth on. I mean, Audie Murphy didn't have all the medals some of these guys have, and that kind of miscues the perception of the Vietnam vet, because these guys out there and tell these wild stories and wear all these badges and so forth and become real first-class horses rear ends. Okay? Now let's talk about South Vietnam and compare that to what the news media says. This is the presidential palace. Now it's called the Reunification Palace or Center. That is the South Vietnamese flag. You got to be real careful when you put that up. Don't put it upside down. The government of the Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam, came into being as a result of the 1954 Geneva Accord, which legally established both North and South Vietnam as separate and independent countries. Okay? It was not one country with part of it being communist and one part of it being democratic. It was two separate countries. The United States or South Vietnam signed the accords calling for general elections. I've heard that since I came home, that the United States was afraid to have elections because they were scared to death that Ho Chi Minh would win the election. Ho Chi Minh was not going to win the election in the South. Millions of people, when the communists took over North Vietnam, came south just to get away from the communists and so forth, which we'll go into in a little bit. And the accords were drawn up, but Russia did not sign it. China didn't sign it. North Vietnam didn't sign it. South Vietnam didn't sign it. The American didn't sign it about the elections. It was part of the agreement. What was never agreed to. That was the second part of the agreement. After everybody agreed. That's like, oops, let's add this to the agreement, and we'll just go ahead and add it in, and everybody think it's part of it all along. But it didn't happen that way. Okay? Now, the first president of South Vietnam was Diem. He was overthrown and assassinated in November of 1963. Now, was it a coincidence or not? I can't tell you. But shortly after he was assassinated, Kennedy was assassinated, President John F. Kennedy. There were military coups and leadership changes over the next 19 months. The South Vietnamese government was somewhat in a turmoil during that period of time, but finally the government stabilized in June 1965 when Nguyen Cao Ky became prime minister. Nguyen Cao Ky was to say the least, flamboyant. He always had absolutely gorgeous women on his arm. His wife she could have been a model anywhere. But the picture I have in the middle here was Diem, the first president, was not married. But his brother was married, and her name was Madame New. And that's her picture. she kind of did the things that the First Lady would do, but she was somewhat of a character herself. If you've ever seen the picture of the Buddhist who burned himself, she made the comment about they should have more Buddhist barbecues like that. And she actually, when the coup was going on, she survived because I believe she was in France on a shopping spree. But then his brother were killed in an assassination. But she was very big, and she just died not too long ago, a few years ago. But she was quite a character herself, so it created some. But Khe was also an Air Force pilot as well as the prime minister, and from what I can, he was pretty good at governing and so forth. He brought the country together. Okay. There he is, picture again, and then after him, they had elections in '67. Results of Nguyen Van Thu became president, and Nguyen Cao Khe became vice president. Now, if you notice, both of them are names of Nguyen. I believe if you put 10 people together, 9 of them from Vietnam are going to be named Nguyen. Okay, became vice president. Thu was elected in a Democratic election with 9 different groups having candidates. You think we have a problem with 2 and 3 parties? They had 9 parties going there. Thu won with just 35% of the votes. When you start dividing them up by 9, that's not too bad. The majority of the U.S. media claimed the elections were rigged. In 1975, the UN Security Council voted 8-1 with the Soviet Union the only dissenting vote. The General Assembly voted 59-9 to admit South Vietnam into the UN. So evidently the UN thought it was a bona fide government, but as you can see there, Khe with his scarf and so forth. But now, people always say, as I mentioned just a minute ago, why the reporters didn't report more on North Vietnam? Because they didn't have a free press. South Vietnam had a lot of corruption, but you also had people who gave everything they had for their country. The government of South Vietnam allowed a free press and thousands of reporters from all over the world and travel throughout the country freely. Now, the American reporters would come in, and you had all at French, and about every nation you could think of had reporters there, and there wasn't a whole lot of censorship. You could say what you wanted to do. When South Vietnam fell, the South Vietnamese media consisted of 28 Vietnamese language daily newspapers, 11 others in Chinese and English and French. So the newspapers were out there, and you could get the news and so forth, okay? There were also weekly, bi-weekly, and monthly publications covering politics and a full range of topics. There were 24 radio stations and 3 TV stations, all competing in a free market. All of them trying to get the news out there. The idea of a corrupt, brutally repressive, all-powerful dictatorship in South Vietnam is just simply a myth. Another one of those misunderstandings and myths that are out there about the Vietnam War and the corruption in South Vietnam. Now, who ran Vietnam, North Vietnam and the communists? Well, the figurehead was Ho Chi Minh, but he was getting old, somewhat senile. So actually, the guy who ran the Vietnam War and the Vietnam government was Le Duan, General Secretary of the Central Committee of the Communist Party. And you can see right there, Ho Chi Minh, Le Duan, that's the list of the people who were on the Politburo there, who did the voting and so forth. China admits 320,000 troops fought in Vietnam. They just did a little bit of support there. There are widely held beliefs that the government of North Vietnam was popular to the point of being revered. I heard, even when I was in Vietnam, that even the South Vietnamese revered Ho Chi Minh, Uncle Ho, as they called him. Especially among the draft-dodging groups back in the United States, he was revered. In 1954, the Geneva Accords called for free elections to be held in 1956. And again, it was unsigned agreement. Nobody ever agreed to the agreement by either side. Some conventional wisdom believed that if South Vietnam and its American ally had agreed to those countrywide free elections in 1956, then the South Vietnamese people would have overwhelmingly joined Ho Chi Minh and his communist group. Nonsense. so many millions of the people, Vietnamese, came south when the communists took over. And today they were up, even though today all of Vietnam is communist, they don't really celebrate Ho Chi Minh's birthday as they did back in the day. Tens of thousands of Vietnamese left the communist north and moved south when the two countries were set up to escape communism. The North Vietnamese had never really held a free election. Still haven't. In 1956, the government of the communist North were in the midst of their land reform, and in the process, they were murdering tens of thousands of their own people. In other words, if you were going to be a patriot and you're in North Vietnam and you own an acre of land, the only way you could be a patriot was to give that land to the government. Now, that was going to be how you fed your family and so forth. But if you didn't give it to you, we'll see what happened to you. Okay. Even peasant farmers in North Vietnam with as little as 1 acre of land were being executed for their landlord mentality. Their thinking wasn't right. Because, hey, you might even rent that stuff out. You just think you're better than you are because you own an acre of land. These mass killings in 1956 stirred such resentment in the North that it created a real crisis for the communist governing body. The people, the farmers, rice farmers of North Vietnam were getting fed up with the communist government taking their land and killing their farmers and so forth in the process. So Ho Chi Minh had to step in. Uncle Ho kind of put himself separated from the government. He's not part of the government. He's Uncle Ho. Everybody loved Uncle Ho, we just talked about. And he came in and had to make a statement. Now, the truth of the statement is not exactly, won't pass muster, but let's just see what he had to say here. Okay? Ho read an apologetic letter over the radio in order to the people of North Vietnam. The communists released about 12,000 of their own who were waiting to be executed, and the 50,000 already executed were deemed a mistake and declared them national heroes of the revolution. In other words, we went out and killed 50,000 of our own people. Oops, we made a mistake there, but they're heroes now. Okay? What would have happened if the Americans did that? Or South Vietnam? We call all these people, they're heroes. They gave the life for the country. No, they gave the life for the communist government to take over their land. Okay? Myths and truths of the Vietnam-American War. Truth. The so-called Southern communists, the Viet Cong, were created by the Hanoi Communist government. Always heard that they were left over in the South, and the communist government of North Vietnam didn't have anything to do with them for a while. Was not supplying them with arms. It was just the group down there that was causing all the problems. And later they just kind of brought them into the fold because they were thinking the same way. No, that's not the way it works. A lot of the people who were a part of the Vietnam and so-called Viet Cong were actually nationalists. And I'll tell you a little bit later what happened to them. In 1975, when the North Vietnamese communists took over all of Vietnam, the Viet Cong and the nationalists not only did not have a place in the new government, many of them were put into the re-education camps. In other words, these Viet Cong who fought for the North didn't have their thinking right, because they wanted Vietnam to be a nationalist but not communist. So they had, just along with the South Vietnamese soldiers, had to go to re-education camps to get their mind taken care of properly. And if they didn't, chances are they never came out of the re-education camps. There's Walter again. Problems with the strategy of attrition. Because the way we fought the Vietnam War, in other wars, we take Sicily, and we took the islands away from Japan, and so we moved forward, and that's how you could tell whether you're winning and losing. But the way we were fighting the war, in a guerrilla war, the way we were fighting it, you couldn't tell today whether you won or lost, because you go in there and take Hill 875 today, and tomorrow you're getting back on the helicopter and leaving it, which means next week you got to go back and take that hill again. Then if you take that hill twice, how do you know that you're gaining ground? Because you ain't. So they come up with body count. Okay. During the war, the U.S. media again and again accused the United States military of overestimating and reporting of body counts, the number of killed of the communist military. And we said a while ago, the first 10 days of Tet, they lost 30,000. Okay. How did that number come about? Today, the North Vietnamese government openly admits to losing nearly 1,300,000 of their military. Yes, there were some body count exaggerations. Let me tell you. Let's just say that I'm a lieutenant and I've got a squad that's supposed to go out. The captain comes to me and says, Lieutenant, the major's on my back. I got to have a good body count today. In fact, if you give me a good body count, it's going to make me look good with the major, and the major's going to look good with the colonel, and the colonel's going to look good with the general. I'll give y'all an in-country R&R. Y'all can go down to the beach at Vung Tau and swim and visit the girls and drink all the beer you want, and for 3 or 4 days. Now, my job is to look after my men, to make sure they're taken care of. So I'm going to bring back a good body count. One of the problems, though, was the Viet Cong, or the North Vietnamese Army, or we'll just say the communists, because they're all one and the same. Whenever there was a battle, when they left, they usually took their bodies of their wounded with them. It was very important to their heritage and their religion to take. So quite often there was a blood trail. And there was probably a lot of blood trails that were counted as body counts. You had to estimate. And evidently, we didn't estimate high enough because they lost 1,300,000 during the part. Now, what it says there? Well, this is what Walter Cronkite had to say. What led to a body count mentality? Many reports were exaggerated or falsified. North Vietnamese were always able to replace their losses, while Americans became disillusioned with the mounting death toll. See, Ho Chi Minh said off from day one, you can kill all of us you want to, but we'll keep right on coming. We're going to keep right on replacing them. We're going to have we're going to have new children coming along, and they're going to grow up, and we're going to keep right on going. You just won't be able to kill us all. You ever tried to killing all the cockroaches or rats in an area? You can't do it. The nightly news broadcast reported U.S. deaths versus North Vietnamese deaths. In other words, today we lost 5 Americans. But the North Vietnamese communists lost 35. Okay, and if you look at it's probably balanced a little bit, something like that. If ours were less, we were winning. That was supposed to be how we could tell whether they're winning. If we killed more of them today than they killed of us, then we won today, unless you were one of those ones that got killed. North Vietnamese showed a remarkable capability to cope, rebuild, and repair. Anyone was never broken. Yes, that's because they were drafting children and women in their army. And once you got in the communist army, your chance of ever getting back home was slim to none, of ever seeing your family again. Where the Americans only served basically 1 year. Reporter Peter Arnett was fired by CNN for fake news. See, he came back out and said that the U.S. military in Vietnam supposedly gassed their own men, which was proven not true. He was actually working for, I believe, Newsweek when he said that the communists got inside the embassy. Excuse me, he was fired. It was NBC and National Geographic, for his anti-American prejudice and coverage of the United States military. Now, there's a picture of South Vietnamese Prime Minister and Vice President Nguyen Cao Ky. Now, people say that when Thu came in, or Diem came in as president of South Vietnam, that they went in and wiped out the Buddhists. No. They did attack some of the Buddhist temples who were aiding and abetting the communists. But the Prime Minister and Vice President, Nguyen Cao Ky, was a Buddhist. The government was dominated by Catholics, just like JFK, but he was a Buddhist, and he wouldn't have stood for the Buddhist religion to be killed off and so forth. So all that history just is no longer history. It's a myth and a miscalculation and so forth. Okay. Let's talk about the general. This is the North Vietnamese general, by the way, General Vo Nguyen Giap. In the United States and international media, Giap, who got his early military training from America. Americans taught him how to fire a weapon. Americans taught him how to do strategy to fight the Japanese. He is widely held as a military genius. In fact, when he died, all these news articles came out, how much he was a genius and how he just was, he just beat the Americans all to death. You remember a while ago when I said the North, they claimed or now admit to losing 1,300,000 of their own military in deaths? Now let's look at that in comparison. With the 1974 U.S. Census, this is the equivalent of America losing 12 million Americans killed in Vietnam. Now, if you were a general, like Westmoreland right there, and you lost 12 million men, do you think he'd be considered a genius? He lost 58,000. And a lot of people said he was a lousy general. What if he'd lost 12 million? So you got to keep things in perspective. 1,300,000 lost. And with the American population, that would be 12 million. And Giap still looked at as a genius. But I tell you what, the people who look at Giap as a genius are idiots. Enough said. Okay. Myth, Vietnam was one country. The widely held myth that Vietnam was one country but had been artificially divided by a blundering foreign government is just that, a myth. Vietnam was considered two separate countries all the way back to the 15th century. Okay. The fact is just throwing out the Chinese in the 15th century, the southern Nguyen and the northern Trend became engaged in a series of bitter and bloody struggles that lasted for 200 years. The Tang dynasty revived the civil service exams. In 1630, the southern Nguyen officially divided Vietnam into two separate countries by constructing two huge walls across the waste of Vietnam near Dong Ha, which, by the way, is where the DMZ was between North and South Vietnam in the 50s. This is some pictures of different parts of the country. As you can see right there, Vietnam was actually right there, divided into the 5 different countries. There are today language and custom differences between the North and the South. They celebrate Tet at a different time. Their language and different. I can't tell you the difference, but our North Vietnamese can listen to a Southerner and tell a difference, and I know the Southerners can tell a difference there too. But that's the Nguyen dynasty and some of their clothes they had. They were there from 1802 to 1945, some of the Nguyen dynasty. Okay. Now, another myth. Drug use was rampant in Vietnam. As you can see right there, the pipe, that was probably an opium pipe. And you probably recognize the roach right there, or the marijuana cigarette and the hard drugs. Yes, there were drugs in Vietnam because that's where they grow them. Okay, and it was very, very easy to get. But up until the late 70s or early 70s when we were there, was drugs getting to be a problem. But see, where did they come from? You had druggies from the United States getting drafted and going to Vietnam. They didn't quit using drugs because they went to Vietnam. They just picked it up there. Yes, there was probably some people who learned about drugs in Vietnam and took it back. The overwhelming percentage of American drug users were civilians, and very high percentage of the anti-war actors were drug users. The number of arrests by the military during the war represents a much smaller percentage of drug users among the military than in overall civilian populations during the war. Now, let me ask you something. Let's just say you're out in a base camp somewhere, surrounded by jungles and bad guys. How happy are you going to be that the guy next to you is thrown out of his mind on drugs and you're under attack? He ain't worth a damn protecting your life. So the guys out in the field quite often took care of the drug problems of themselves. Again, I'm not saying it was there. I had in my group where I was at in Vietnam in 67, 68, I think we had 5 or 6 potheads there that got stoned out of their mind every night on drugs. We come on alert. I'd help them get dressed and put their rifle in their hand. And send them out one door and I'd go out the other. Now, the drug of choice in Vietnam was beer. Okay. I have a picture of a house that was completely built out of beer cans, and I couldn't find it, but I was going to bring it. The beer of choice in Vietnam was the 33 beer, or the one down here in the left-hand corner. It's called Tiger Beer, or as we used to call it, Tiger Piss. And you see some of the beers there, Hams, Miller, Falstaff, and the water wasn't fit to drink. Let me tell you something. The water, I never saw a stream in Vietnam, wasn't dirty, slimy, water with creepy crawlers in it, and you knew you were going to die. In fact, today they have discovered that a lot of us who drank the water got a fluke. That fluke grew in our bodies and have not shown up for the last 40 or 50 years. And that's now discovering it. And there's no cure for it until it's too late. So drinking the water was not exactly what you wanted to do if you were out someplace. But as you can see, the helicopters taking a few cans of beer out to the soldiers and so forth in the field, because those canteens of water. But it was kind of funny. Whenever I went out with the guys as an engineer, we went out with the 9th Infantry, we always carried them a case of beer, and which they'd put in their pocket. They wouldn't drink it until the end of the day. And when they were sending us off at the end of the day, they'd pop that hot beer and drink it down at night. So, but that was most of the drug of choice and so forth. Okay. Now, the myth, draft dodgers protested against the war. No. Truth. The truth is they did not want to be inducted into the military. When the draft went to the lottery system, war protesting went down. In other words, originally you were drafted by your hometown draft board, but later it was like a bingo game. They put the dates of your birth like a bingo ball, and it pops up, and that's what day. In 1973, when Congress ended the draft and anti-war protesters almost ceased entirely. Now, here's some of the signs they had. Girls say yes to boys who say no. In other words, the girls would entertain the boys who said no to getting drafted. Hell no, we won't go. Make love, not war. Hey, if I was a young guy back in those days and single, that would probably get me going. I'd go, let me go join the protest. Make love, not war. I'd much rather not make war. Resist the draft. Don't register for the draft. Okay. Now, if they were protesting the war, why are they carrying the communist Vietnamese flags? If you see right there, I have one arrowhead going two flags. Then I have another flag. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There are 5 communist flags flying there and 1 American flag. Why are they, if they're such loving patriots for America, why are they carrying a communist flag? If they're supporting those of us who were in Vietnam fighting, why are they so carrying the flags of the people who are killing us and killing their own people? While protesting against America's involvement in Vietnam may have made sense, but why were they waving Viet Cong flags and burning American flags? Drugs, and they really won't really protest in the water. It just don't send my butt. Okay. Now let's talk about another form of protest. Up in the top right-hand picture is Jane Fonda and a man by the name of Tom Hayden. Tom Hayden, we used to call him Mr. Jane Fonda, and I want to look him up so I can tell you about him. Tom Hayden who burst out of the 1960s countercultures as a radical leader of American civil rights and anti-war movements, but rocked the boat more gently later in life with a progressive political agenda as an author and California state legislator. During the racial unrest and anti-war protests of the 1960s and early 70s, Mr. Hayden was one of the nation's most visible radicals. He was founder of Students for a Democratic Society, a defendant of the Chicago 7 trial after the riots of the 1968 Democratic Convention. And he helped convince Jane Fonda, as you can see there on the bottom picture, that was Jane Fonda, the actress, before Tom Hayden got her. And then you can see her there holding up the power fist with where she was arrested and so forth. The war lasted 10 plus years. 58,242 Americans lost their lives in attempting to preserve the sovereignty of South Vietnam. During those years, approximately 56,000 Americans were killed by drunk drivers. Yet, nobody ever saw Tom Hayden or Jane Fonda lead a violent demonstration or any demonstration against liquor, nor having her picture taken destroying alcohol, as she did having her picture taken sitting an anti-aircraft gun in Hanoi. Okay. They had the selective thoughts there. There she is sitting at the anti-aircraft gun, and there she's holding her, making a face and holding her face. And I want to read this. This is actually a quote that she made when she spoke at Duke University some years back during the war. Let me move forward a little bit here. I would think that if you understood what communism was, you would hope, you would pray on your that you would suddenly become communist. So she wasn't just an American protester. She was instilling to our youth and the universities how great communism was. And she's never been tried for treason. And there she is, holding her head, making fun of the blonde-haired, blue-eyed murderers who are coming down, and she's going to shoot them down out of the sky. Okay? Now, let's talk about the welcome home, because we're running out of time here, and I've got to get going. Traditional Americans have always supported its armed forces and have shown great respect for those in uniform. In 1919, at the end of World War I, the Doughboys returned home from Europe to ticker-tape victory parades, marching bands, speeches, and the goodwill of all Americans. Welcome home heroes. Additionally, when the soldiers returned home from World War II and the Korean War, they were treated as heroes. An euphoric atmosphere overtook the nation, and celebrations were held in the country of their honor all around the country. Everybody remembers the picture of the sailor who grabbed a woman in Times Square and was giving her a big kiss. Unfurled American flags that decorated streets and homes could be seen waving in the breeze. Reveling continued nonstop for weeks. It seems as though the nation and its citizens could not do enough for the returning servicemen and women. A grateful nation was anxious to show its admiration and support the returning soldiers. You see the ticker paper. Unfortunately, this was not the case when the soldiers returned home from Vietnam. As a result of America's perceived loss in Vietnam, how did we lose the war? We weren't there. We'd already left. There was a misperception that the men who fought there did not measure up to predecessors in World War II and Korea. And the first part of this show and the story, I kind of showed you that that wasn't the truth. Perhaps the coolest aspect of the war was the treatment of the returning soldiers. As it says there on the poster, we expected nothing in Vietnam. When we got home, nothing's what we got. Now we have each other. That's why there's such a bond between Vietnam vets today. We were called baby killers. All kinds of things, drug addicts. Unlike the hero status given to returning soldiers from World War II, the soldiers that were served in Vietnam were portrayed as baby killers, psychos, drug addicts, and warmongers. It was not an uncommon scene for returning soldiers to be confronted at airports by protesters carrying signs with anti-war slogans and plastic bags with urine and dog feces and so forth were called thrown off and so forth. There's been a lot of controversy whether Vietnam veterans were spit on. Some Vietnam veterans say were spit on, and some of the more liberal people in the country says they can find no record of it. but the treatment in itself was bad enough as it was without one way, whether spit on or not, was just, it didn't make any difference, okay? This is by an article by a gentleman by the name of Ken Moffett. He remembers an incident after return home. One of my close friends and I were walking down the street in Oakland, California. That was his first mistake. When a filthy, long-haired, flea-infested piece of street trash approached us and began yelling insults at us. Mike wanted to take him out right there, but we decided to pass it up. This common sight on the streets of America during the Vietnam War years was in no way reminiscent of the homecoming given the returning soldiers from previous wars. There's people greeting us at the airports, calling us names, and so forth. And how many babies you killed today? Often the general public could not separate returning soldier from the war. Today, if a soldier goes off to Afghanistan and Iraq, they come home and just it's unbelievable the difference. And I'm more for them. But see, when we came home, we were called the first people that ever lost the war. The American Legion, the VFW's organization didn't want us. We were baby killers. We were lost the war. We were shunned even by these veterans. That's why Vietnam Veterans of America's slogan is, we would never do to veterans what was done to us. But we were called baby killers, lost the war, and so forth. Now, let's talk about the fall of Saigon. As I mentioned before, this was not the American Embassy, as the newspaper said. This was the CIA building, which is still there. I saw it a couple of years ago when I was back over, and the embassy building is no longer there. One of the reasons for the mass chaos was the American ambassador refused to believe that things were going to end with the communist rush to take Saigon. I think he thought the American government was going to step in and stop them, but Congress was not going to do it. The boat people. If things were so bad for the South Vietnamese people when the American military was there and the South Vietnamese government was in power, you hear about all the atrocities that Americans did and how corrupt the Vietnamese government was. Why were there no boat people? Why didn't the people of South Vietnam do the same thing when the communists took over and get on boats? As you can see, they're well overloaded boats and try to flee. They didn't. They didn't flee until the communists took over by the millions. After the war, many Vietnamese refugees fled on the open seas. A lot of them were drowned. A lot of the ships were attacked by Somalian pirates, and killed and robbed. And they just gave everything they had. They just got on the boats, left everything they had, money, clothes, home, everything. Okay. Once the true colors of the communists were shown, the conditions got so bad that the people of the South fled. But they were also joined by Northerners as well, because some of those Northerners were nationalists and didn't necessarily want to go along with communists. But that's a re-education camp there of some of the people there. And if you want to know some horror stories, I'll let you talk to some of my friends who spent 10 to 15 years in these re-education camps or slave labor camps. Betrayed. We joined their dreams. We fought side by side. We deserted them. That's an American soldier, a Marine, who went back to Vietnam in 1994 and saw what had happened to the South Vietnamese military and how our country betrayed South Vietnam. Our Congress, with the Case Church Amendment, who would not let us give any money or support to the South Vietnamese while the Chinese, the Cubans, and the Russians were doing that. Myth. The media had reported that suicide American Vietnam veterans ranged from 50,000 to 100,000, 6 to 11 times the non-Vietnam veteran population. The fact is, the mortality studies show that 9,000 is better estimate. The CDC Vietnam Experience Study mortality assessment showed that during the first 5 years after discharge, deaths from suicide are 1.7 times more likely among Vietnam veterans than non-Vietnam veterans. I think, though, today that has gotten a little higher because a lot of the Vietnam veterans came home, got a job, started their families and so forth, and busy. Now they're starting to retire, and the horrors and the things of Vietnam are starting to come back and get them. They're having PTSD is coming in now. So you're having more people, us older guys are having more problems now with the Vietnam War than when we first came back. If you know somebody that's out there who's having problems, please have them to call the Veterans Crisis Line. There are good people there. The 1-800-273-8255, press 1. Okay. Myth, the common belief that the fighting in Vietnam was not as intense as in World War II. Fact, the average infantryman in South Pacific during World War II saw about 40 days of combat. Now, there's 2 young Americans in World War II holding a Japanese flag. And over here is 2 young Americans in the Vietnam War holding a North Vietnamese flag. World War II veterans saw 40 days of combat. The average infantryman in Vietnam saw 240 days of combat due to the helicopter. Okay. 1 out of every 10 Americans who served in Vietnam was a casualty. 58,148 were killed and 304,000 wounded of 2.7 million who served. Although the percentage that died is similar to other wars, amputations or crippling wounds were 300% higher than in World War II. 75,000 Vietnam veterans are severely disabled. And I think the war in Afghanistan and Iraq is going along the same way because of the medical stuff has gotten so much better. There's still a lot of brain injury and amputations and so forth. One of the reasons was the medical helicopter flew nearly 500,000 missions. Over 900,000 patients were airlifted, nearly half were Americans. The average time lapse between wounding to hospitalization was less than an hour. As a result, less than 1% of all who survived the first 24 hours died. In World War II, aircraft losses were 16%, and in Vietnam, it was 43%. In World War II, some pilots completed tours after 25 missions. In other words, they did their tours in 25 missions at an average 4 hours per mission and came home, for a total of 100 hours. In Vietnam, 100 hours was an average month for many with 25 missions a week average. You see the difference the helicopters made, so forth. These are some notes I've got. As we noted in part 1 of the Compassions and Myth Killers, a large number of Americans feel they know all about the Vietnam War and the men and women who are involved. Where did they get this perception and information? They got it from short clips of the news media who show just short clips of what happens, never really goes into details. You always heard that a picture's worth 10,000 words, but not that that picture's worth 10,000 truths. It's perception that picture gives, not the truth. War protesters, most were protesting not to go themselves. There were a few who honestly believed. America never had a real live war brought to them daily in living color. There's nothing pretty about war. It's raw, dirty, and people die. You know, in movies, they get shot and they get up, and they don't do that in real life. America was a time of change and revolution. There was so much going on during there. War protesters, celebrities using their right as celebrity. There was civil rights, voting rights, women's rights, all kinds of rights going on. Dress was changing, rock and roll. The news was delivered by a reporter who was a celebrity in themselves. They could not get the real truth of the men and women returning from the war because they didn't want to ask. After all, they were drugged out psychotics that killed babies, raped women, and burned their homes down. They wouldn't ask us because they didn't want to know about all the babies we'd killed. They could anytime a Vietnam vet could go off on a psychotic drug-induced rage and start shooting people at home. The movies that reinforced these stereotypes. The movies had us out there doing all these things on a daily basis because that's what sold movies. Internet today, if you look at internet today, right now you can go in and find an internet story to prove anything that you want proven. Doesn't make a difference whether it's true. There's some information on the internet will show it. It's just the way it works. The war documentaries. The war documentaries out there who are defining what the history of the Vietnam War about are so wrought with misinformation themselves. Either they're getting their information off the internet or they have agenda. There's some good ones out there, but you got to take them with a grain of salt because they're not always what you see, what you not get. Okay? A quote from Medal of Honor recipient, General Patrick Brady, "Let me give you Vietnam in a nutshell. It matches in unselfishness anything we ever did. There was really nothing in it for us in a material sense. We were simply trying to help a helpless people be free from a horrible evil of communism. And a Vietnam veteran fought with a valor and humanitarianism never before seen in any war in our history. Yet we're out there pegged as creating atrocities, all these other things that we were supposed to have done. And this man received a Medal of Honor for that. I thank you for tuning in to the show. If you want to check some of the things, go to Vietnam Veterans for Factual History. They come out with a newsletter now that you can go out there. But go out there and get the information. Check me to make sure I was right. Our next show will be on deserters, April 25th. So we'll tune in on April 25th, and I promise not to go over. Thank you again for the show. Thank you, sir.
You are tuned to the Nissan Communications Network. If you tuned in too late, you can always watch each program in its entirety or download an MP3 audio file of it in the archives section at nissancommunications.com. Don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel, follow us on Twitter, and like us on Facebook. Sponsored by Telestream's Wirecast software, StreamingGear.com, Carolina Apparel, and DeltaForce.net.